Hi, so in this next video we will take a look at the second topic regarding the authorization and authentication topics, and this time we will try to introduce a tenant-based system. That means that, for example, a customer should always belong to a tenant and all the associated data with it. So this means that first of all, being able to assign a user a tenant. This means that you interact only for a given tenant as a user with the system, and then when you create customers, for example, then these customers will also belong to this tenant. So there are several ways how to solve this problem, and actually the Cuba people have an example which we will lean on. It's called something like SaaS software or something. But let's see. So the first thing that we need to do in order to being able to assign tenant-related data or tenant-related identifiers to customer document order product data is that we will create a new entity. In this case, we can call it like standard tenant entity or something. And this entity will not be like a regular entity which has a proper table and something to display, but it will be a mapped superclass. And a mapped superclass is something where you can create attributes and other entities can extend this entity here, this mapped superclass, and will inherit all the attributes that are defined here, but they will be stored in the corresponding table. So it will be like, for example, we can create a new attribute here, like tenant ID, and let's make it a UUID for now, just as some kind of identifier. And then in the end, this tenant ID will actually live in the table of the customer. And this is what we will do. Okay, so let's create that. Yeah, we don't need a instance name for now. And then we will just go to the customer entity. And here it says it's extending standard entity, which comes from Cuba directly, but we will take this one here. And with that, nothing really changed for now, but if we try to start the application, then Cuba should recognize that, and we actually can take a look at the scripts that should get applied to the database. And in this case, it will create a column tenant ID and set the tenant ID to 0 wherever this tenant ID is null. This is like a fail-safe mechanism for our existing data. And then it will make the tenant ID not null. Okay, we can update this database. But we will not start the application yet, since we don't want to develop some other kind of logic here. There are two sides that we have to think about. So the first one is the time when a new entity gets created. In this case, it will be a new customer. And then the question is, how does the system at the end of the day write a UUID into this field? Because we actually configured it to be not nullable, meaning that you have to provide a value. And obviously the user should not directly interact with this column or with this attribute, because it's more like a technical attribute. So therefore we will just configure it in a piece of code that we'll just write right here. So we can create a method like in a tenant ID, and this in a tenant ID will be called every time an instance of this entity is created. Therefore, we use this post construct annotation, which will be evaluated by Spring and will be actually after, like internally, this new thing is called. It will actually call this method, and we can define certain logic in here. And what we will do at the end of the day is set tenant ID, right? So the question is, how do we get this tenant ID? It's actually UID. And what we can do here is that we call app beans in order to get an existing bean from the cuba-platform itself, which is called user session source. And with that, we can actually get some information about the current user and about its current session. We will see later why this is so important. So first of all, we will create let's do it like this. It's not an object, but it's the user session source. And this has a method called, oh, actually I'm wrong. What's that thing here? It's user session source. And we can get user session, and then we can get some kind of attributes. And we will see later where this is required, but we will for now just use the session attribute, which is called tenant ID, and do it like this, and then we will use that in order to set the tenant ID of this entity instance. In case it's not found, then we might throw an exception. So with that, we are actually setting the right tenant ID that is based in this user session attributes, and just have a look how this works. Okay, let's log into the system and see if we can create a customer. And what we see now is this illegal argument exception that I just threw in the code. And the reason is that in my user session as an administrator right now, I don't have this attribute tenant ID because I never configured it by any means. This is where this whole access groups come into play, and we have not covered it yet, but let's take a look. So the access groups is like a tree structure where for each entry in this groups you can associate users, and in fact a user can only be in one particular access group. And for an access group you can configure session attributes. On the one hand, this is this tab here, and we will just create something like this for now. But first let's create a user just like that, and yeah, we can give it the administrator role, doesn't really matter for now. And then we will create another tenant user. And as you might have seen, you have to pick a group or an access group that is where this user will be placed in. When we refresh this page, we should be able to see that we have both of our new users here. And what we will do now is to create two access groups, just like that. And we will assign this tenant1 user to this access group tenant1, and accordingly for the other user. And now we come to our session attributes. So what we can do is that we will create some random attribute here. In this case, we will exactly call it tenant ID, because this is what we reference in the code. We give it a type, and then we can give it some kind of value. In order to make that happen, I will just take a look at this update scripts and for now configure this UID. And the same goes for this. And we should do one additional thing, which is actually creating an entity called tenant, where we are capable of managing the tenants, and it might be interesting to have such a normal entity for later usage. So let's just stop that here, create a new entity called tenant. Let's give it a name, and let's give it a code. We can just real quick generate some screens, update the database, and then we should be able to log in. So let's see. When we now create a customer, then it will still say that the administrator has no capabilities of creating one because there is no tenant attached. This is actually true because when we take a look in this access group, which is called this company access group here, it says the administrator is part of that group and both of the other users here as well. So what we have to do in order to get this session attribute to our session, we have to log in as one of the tenant users. So as you can see, now the exception is not thrown anymore, but rather it is will fill this session attribute into this entity. We can actually test that. And store this customer. And when we go to the entity inspector and take a look at the customer, we should be able to see this tenant ID here, which is all zeros. Okay, what we can do now is that we first of all create two tenants. Just like that. And actually this entities does not really at this point give any value, so it's just more like documentation purpose. But what it gives us, we can actually right click in here and find the system information and get the UUIDs. And let's for now just change them or put them manually into the session attributes here. And with that, when we create yet another customer, we can take another look at the entity inspector. And now we see that Bart Simpson in this case has the corresponding tenant ID assigned to it. So this is the first part because we only deal with the inserting the data and associating the correct values to this business data. And the second part is that we actually want to restrict the access to the data only to the given tenant I am in as a user. So for example, saying I'm like a tenant 1 user, then I should only see the data from my particular tenant. But as we see, so from this issue perspective, everything is done. And I will actually commit all of this stuff that we have. And the next topic will then be as we just saw, so that back office users should only see certain tenant related data.